Hello again, welcome back to Medicplacebo. In today's video, I'll be teaching you about the anatomy of the skull. So, the skull can be broadly classified into two components, that is, the neurocranium and the viscerocranium. So, the neurocranium would make up the roof and the base of the skull. Commonly, the roof of the skull is also known as the calvaria, and we have the viscerocranium, which make up the facial skeleton of the skull. So here we can take a look that the highlighted region comprises the neurocranium. The neurocranium protects and encloses the brain in itself, and the other part which we have is the viscerocranium, which comprises of the facial skeleton. So the neurocranium is made up of 8 bones, that are the frontal, which is an unpaired bone and is present in the region of the forehead. Then we have the parietal bone, which is present posterior to the frontal bone. Then we have the temporal bone, which is located at the lateral side of the skull. These are also paired bones. Then we have the occipital bone. The occipital is an unpaired bone present at the posterior surface of the skull. Then we have the ethmoid bone, which is also an unpaired bone and would give rise to the superior and the middle nasal concha. And lastly, we have the sphenoid bone, which is also an unpaired bone. So these 8 bones comprises the neurocranium of the skull, whereas the viscerocranium of the skull is formed by 14 bones. That is, we have 14 facial bones which are classified depending upon the location. So in the temporal region, we have the presence of the zygomatic bone. In the region of nose, we have 4 bones, which are the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, the vomer, and the inferior nasal concha. Here, the nasal and the lacrimal bone are the paired ones, whereas the vomer and the inferior nasal concha are the unpaired bones. In the region of jaw, we have the maxilla and mandible. And lastly, in the region of mouth, we have the palatine bone and the hyoid bone. So we will be discussing each of these bones in much more detail in the further upcoming videos. Here I wanted to note that these bones are connected to one another with the help of the sutures in case of an adult skull, but during the fetal period the sutures are absent in the skull, and instead of suture we have a membranous bony plate known as fontanelles. So these fontanelles help during the pregnancy, allowing the head of the baby to be adjusted according to the required conditions, and it also helps in the growth and development of the baby postnatally. So the fontanelles have an important role in providing flexibility and at the same time providing the space for the brain to grow after the birth of the baby. So it helps in growth of the brain. And according to the position of bone, we have various fontanelles, like in between frontal bone and the parietal bone we have the presence of the anterior fontanelle. Between the parietal bone and the occipital bone we have the presence of the posterior fontanelle. Between the parietal, sphenoid and the frontal bone we have the presence of the sphenoidal fontanelle. And lastly, in between the parietal and the occipital bone we have the presence of the mastoid fontanelle. These fontanelles after birth tend to form the sutures, and they would be later known according to the position of the bones. So as discussed previously, we have the frontal bone present in the region of the forehead. Posterior to the frontal bone we have the parietal bones, and at the posterior most we have the occipital bone. Laterally we have the presence of the temporal bone, and here we can take a look at the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Now, between the frontal and the parietal bone lies the coronal suture. Between the two parietal bones lies the sagittal suture, and between the occipital and the parietal bone lies the lambdoid suture. And in between the parietal and the temporal, we have the presence of the petrosquamous suture. Since we will discuss further that the temporal bone of the skull can be divided into 5 different parts, out of which we have the squamous part present in the uppermost region. So we have the name petrosquamous originating from it. From an examination point of view, there are few important landmarks which you must remember, which are, we have the Nasion, which is present between the frontal and the nasal bone. Here, connecting the parietal, the temporal, the sphenoid and the frontal bone, we have the presence of the Pterion. So we can say that the Pterion is the intersection point of the 4 bones, that are the frontal, the parietal, the temporal and the sphenoid. Anatomical term here is the vertex. The vertex is the highest point which is formed by the 4 bones, that is the occipital posteriorly, the frontal bone anteriorly and the 2 parietal bones. So the highest point on the skull is referred to as the vertex of the skull. Similarly, in between the occipital, the temporal and the parietal bone, there is the presence of the Asterion, and between the parietal and the occipital lies the Lambda. Now, these are some important anatomical terms which are ought to be asked in the exam frequently. So, you need to remember them. That is, the first one being the Pterion, the second, the Nasion, the third, the Asterion, the fourth, the Lambda, fifth, the vertex, and lastly, we have the Bregma. Also, there is a presence of the Glabella, which is the region of the mid part of the frontal bone, located somewhere here. This part is known as the Glabella. So that is it for this video. For continuing, you can watch my next video in which I'll be discussing about the bones of the viscerocranium, that is the bones of the facial skeleton. Thank you.